Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're tackling a giant Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. I'm excited to unpack this one.
It's not just a giant, it's foundational to how we understand economics even today.
Which is kind of wild considering it was written way back in the 1700s. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us the big picture? What's the core of what Smith was trying to do?
Smith wanted to understand what makes nations truly wealthy, and he argued that it wasn't just about a king hoarding gold, but about the productivity of its people. He dives into the division of labor-free markets and how those forces impact everything from wages to profits to rent.
Okay, so it's less about a treasure chest and more about a well-oiled machine of an economy. And he starts right off the bat with this idea of the division of labor, right?
Exactly. He uses the example of a pin factory, which has become incredibly famous.
Yeah, that one really stuck with me too. It seems obvious in hindsight. But the way he breaks down how specializing in each tiny task leads to this massive increase in efficiency, it makes you realize how much we take that concept for granted.
It completely changed how people thought about production. Smith argued that by breaking down complex tasks into simpler ones and letting people specialize, you get incredible gains in skill speed and even innovation.
So instead of one person trying to make a whole pin from start to finish, you get people who get really good at just making the head or just sharpening the point, and suddenly you're churning out pins like nobody's business.
Exactly. And this principle, he argues, applies not just to making pins, but to entire economies. Nations become wealthy not by trying to do everything themselves, but by focusing on what they're best at and trading with others.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But it can't just be about making more stuff right.
Hmm.
Smith also talks about the value of things and this whole idea of real versus nominal prices, which honestly tripped me up a bit.
It's a crucial distinction. Think about it like this. The price tag on something, the nominal price might stay the same for years, but what that money actually gets you, the real value can change dramatically. He used corn prices in his example, which was a staple back then.
Right, like bread is today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the price of a loaf of bread might not change much from one year to the next, but how much work it takes to earn enough to buy that loaf can fluctuate depending on things like wages and the cost of other goods.
So it's about looking beyond the sticker price to understand the underlying effort and resources that go into producing something, which I guess is related to his whole analysis of wages, profit, and rent.
You've got it. Smith argues that these three, wages, profit, and rent, are the fundamental components of any price in a market economy. And he digs deep into the factors that influence each of them.
Like how dangerous a job is can impact how much someone gets paid. He uses the example of a smuggler, high risk, potentially high reward, but more often ending in disaster.
And he actually argues against that kind of reckless risk-taking, which I always found interesting. He wasn't blindly pro-risk. He recognized that some risks were detrimental to both individuals and the economy as a whole.
So he was thinking about the bigger picture, the overall health of the system, not just individual gain. But then where does the invisible hand come in? It feels like that's what Smith is most famous for.
It is, but it's often misunderstood. He's not saying everything magically works out perfectly on its own. The invisible hand is more about how individual self-interest within a well-functioning market can unintentionally benefit society as a whole.
Okay, so it's less about things magically falling into place and more about the unintended consequences of individual actions. But he also acknowledges that there are all sorts of things that can mess with that, right?
Absolutely. He talks about how people try to game the system, keeping price changes secret to protect profits, or how government policies can sometimes backfire and create shortages or gluts. He uses brain as an example, which again feels surprisingly relevant today. He really goes after monopolies and things that restrict trade. He saw them as roadblocks on the path to real wealth creation, ultimately hurting everyone, not just those at the bottom.
He did not hold back. He calls out guilds for limiting apprenticeships to inflate wages, which in the long run stifles competition and new ideas.
That's the key, isn't it? It's about the long game, not just short-term gains. And if we connect this to something we discussed earlier, it's about letting that invisible hand do its work. Monopolies, whether they're created by powerful businesses or by well-intentioned governments, mess with the natural equilibrium of supply and demand.
Right. It's like a rising tide lifts all boats, but if a few boats build a dam, suddenly they've got a private lake while everyone else is high and dry.
That's a great way to put it. And Smith uses some really vivid historical examples to illustrate this point, like how Spain's obsession with hoarding gold and silver backfired spectacularly.
Talk about missing the forest for the trees. They thought they were rich because their vaults were full of treasure. But Smith argues that real wealth comes from what you can do with that wealth, the goods you produced, the lives you improved.
Exactly. He uses the example of a simple woolen coat to show how many different people with specialized skills are involved in its creation. The shepherd, the spinner, the weaver, the dyer, it's a whole network of interconnected labor, all driven by the invisible hand of the market.
It's mind-blowing. You look at a coat, and you don't think about the intricate web of trade and specialization that went into making it a reality. It makes you appreciate even everyday objects in a whole new light.
Precisely. And that interconnectedness is what Smith saw as the engine of true national wealth.
Okay, so that's monopolies and trade. What about the role of government? That's a hot topic even today.
Smith believed in limited government, but not a complete absence of it. He saw the state as having essential roles like maintaining infrastructure, defending the nation, and even providing public education.
The education piece really stood out to me. Investing in an educated citizenry back then, that was a radical idea.
It was. But he saw it as crucial for a thriving economy, for having a populace capable of participating in all those specialized roles that drive a complex market.
So not just more workers, but smarter workers.
Exactly. And he also argued that the government has a responsibility to protect its people from things like fraud, to ensure fair contracts are upheld, to create a level playing field where everyone can participate in commerce without fear of being cheated or exploited.
So it's less about government bad and more about good government is smart government.
Precisely. It should focus on those areas where it can have the most impact on the well-being of its citizens and the smooth functioning of the market, not on trying to control every last detail.
Yeah. Which makes me think about his view on things like excessive paper money and those banking crises. Too much meddling, even with good intentions, can really throw things out of whack.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial point. Smith wasn't just an economist. He was a moral philosopher. He was deeply interested in human nature, in what motivates us, and how we can create a society that allows us to thrive, not just economically, but also morally.
Which explains why his writing is so engaging even centuries later. It's not just dry economic theory. It's full of insights into human behavior, witty observations, and those colorful historical anecdotes that bring the concepts to life.
Absolutely. He had a knack for explaining complex ideas in a way that was both insightful and entertaining, like his famous line about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker.
Oh, right. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest.
Exactly. He's pointing out that in a free market, it's self-interest that drives people to provide the goods and services that others need, even if it's not their primary motivation.
It's kind of a cynical view of human nature, but also kind of true.
Well, that's the beauty of Smith's work. He doesn't shy away from the complexities of human motivation. He recognizes that we're both self-interested and capable of cooperation, and that a well-functioning society needs to find ways to harness those impulses for the common good.
And he wasn't afraid to call out bad behavior, whether it was from greedy merchants or misguided governments. He really wanted to create a system that worked for everyone and not just the wealthy and powerful.
And that's a big part of why the wealth of nations continues to resonate today. It's not just a historical artifact, it's a roadmap for creating a more just and prosperous world.
It feels especially relevant now with so much discussion about wealth inequality, globalization, and the role of technology in shaping our economy.
Exactly. It's like Smith is having this ongoing conversation with us, challenging us to apply his principles to the challenges of our own time. But there is one area now that you mentioned, technology, that he couldn't have possibly foreseen. He couldn't have predicted the internet or artificial intelligence, but it makes you wonder what he would have made of the incredible technological advancements we've seen and how they've reshaped the global economy.
Right. Like he talks about how the division of labor can lead to the invention of new machines and techniques, but could he have ever imagined something like the internet connecting people and markets across the globe in an instant?
It's fascinating to consider. He was certainly aware of how technological progress could revolutionize society. Just look at the impact of the printing press in his own time.
It democratized knowledge and helped fuel the Enlightenment. So it's not hard to imagine him being both excited and maybe a little wary of the potential of something like the internet.
Exactly. He'd likely be thrilled by the increased connectivity, the potential for greater trade and specialization on a global scale. But knowing his focus on ethical considerations and the well-being of society, he'd probably also be concerned about the potential disruptions.
Like job displacement, increased inequality, the spread of misinformation. things we grapple with even today.
Precisely. And that's what makes his work so relevant. He provides us with a framework for thinking through these challenges, for asking those hard questions about how we ensure that economic progress benefits everyone, not just a select few.
So it's not enough to just marvel at the latest gadgets and gizmos.
Yeah.
We have to consider their impact on society as a whole, just like Smith did with the economic forces of his time.
Exactly. And we have to be mindful of those unintended consequences. Those ways in which our pursuit of self-interest, however natural it might be, can sometimes lead to outcomes that harm rather than help the common good. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where individual ambition and collective well-being can coexist and thrive.
Which is a conversation we're still having today, and likely will be for years to come. It's like Smith left us with this unfinished manuscript, this invitation to keep exploring these ideas and to apply them to the ever-evolving world we live in.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. The Wealth of Nations is more than just a historical text. It's a living document full of insights that continue to resonate and challenge us centuries later.
Absolutely. Well, this deep dive into the Wealth of Nations has been an incredible journey. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for Smith's brilliance and the enduring power of his ideas.
I'm glad to hear it. And I hope it inspires you to keep exploring these topics and to engage in those important conversations about how we create a more just and prosperous world.
I know it has for me. And for our listeners, I hope this has sparked your curiosity. Until next time on Books and Bytes, keep those pages turning.